She was 34 years old, and by the first frost of that October, she owned nothing in the world but a carpetbag, a wool shawl gone thin at the elbows, and $9 folded into a handkerchief. Elias Whitfield, her late husband's father, had stood on the porch of the house she'd shared with Thomas for 11 years and told her plainly that a widow with no children and no name of her own, blood was a burden the family could no longer carry, and that the house, the land, and everything upon it belonged to the Whitfield name and not to her. He said this without raising his voice, which somehow made it crueler, the way a man might explain that the weather had turned and there was nothing to be done about it. She did not argue. She had learned long before that arguing with a man who has already decided the outcome only wastes the breath you'll need for walking. So she took her $9, the handkerchief, the shawl, and the small tin box of sewing needles that had been her mother's, and she walked the 2 miles into the town of Briar Hollow, Colorado Territory, with the wind cutting through her coat and nowhere particular to go. It was there, on the edge of a town that had already begun to whisper about the widow Whitfield walking alone with a carpetbag, that she saw the old livery stable at the end of Cutter Street, its doors hanging crooked, its sign faded to nothing, and a notice nailed to the post announcing it for sale for want of any better offer. The men in the feed store laughed when she asked about it. They told her it was cursed, that no one had stabled a horse there in 6 years. Not since old Jeremiah Cobb had died in the fire that took half the loft with him. And that whatever she paid for it, she'd paid too much. She paid what she had. And what none of them knew, what she herself did not yet know, was that behind the charred beams of that ruined loft was a folded note that would leave the entire town of Briar Hollow standing in silence when its words were finally read aloud. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Clara Doyle Whitfield, if you are watching this from a place that has ever felt forgotten. A town, a home, a piece of land nobody else believed in. Tell us in the comments, because this is a story about exactly that kind of place. And exactly that kind of woman. Clara had been born in 1853 in a farmhouse outside Independence, Missouri, the third of 5 children to a blacksmith named Robert Doyle and his wife Margaret, a woman known throughout the county for her steady hands and her stubborn refusal to let any creature, human or animal, go without care if she could help it. Robert Doyle's forge stood at the crossroads where wagon trains gathered before striking out west, and Clara grew up amid the ring of hammers and the smell of hot iron and the constant coming and going of travelers who arrived, exhausted and left renewed. Her father taught her, against the custom of the time, how to read a horse's gait for lameness before it ever showed in its step, how to judge the soundness of a wagon axle by the sound it made rolling over gravel, and how to keep a ledger honest even when it would have been easy and profitable not to. A ledger is a kind of promise, he used to tell her, tapping the page with an iron-stained finger. Break it once quietly and you've broken it forever, whether anyone catches you or not. Her mother, meanwhile, taught her the quieter arts of a household running on little, how to stretch a week's flour into 2, how to nurse a sick calf through the night, how to mend a coat so many times that the mending itself became a kind of quiet pride rather than a shame. Clara absorbed both her father's precision and her mother's patience, and by the time she was 17, she could shoe a horse nearly as well as any man in the county and keep books cleaner than the banker in town. Though of course no one would have hired a young woman to do either. It was at a wagon crossing near her father's forge that she met Thomas Whitfield, a young man traveling west with his father Elias and a small train of settlers bound for the Colorado gold fields. Though Thomas himself had no taste for prospecting and confessed to Clara, in the hour they spent together while his father's wagon wheel was repaired, that he dreamed, instead of raising horses on open land, of building something that would still be standing long after the gold was gone. There was a gentleness in him that Clara recognized, the same gentleness her father carried beneath his hard hands, And when the wagon train moved on, she found she could not stop thinking of him. He wrote to her for 2 years, letters that arrived smudged with trail dust and creased from months in a saddlebag. And when he returned to Missouri in 1874 to ask her father for her hand, Robert Doyle looked at his daughter's face before he answered and saw the decision already made. They married that spring and traveled west together to Briar Hollow, a young town scraping itself up out of the Colorado foothills, where Thomas's family had staked a claim and built a modest but respectable house on Larkspur Road. Elias Whitfield had never much cared for Clara. He was a hard, calculating man who measured people the way he measured cattle, by weight and utility. And a blacksmith's daughter with dirt under her nails and opinions of her own did not weigh, in his estimation, very much at all. But Thomas loved her plainly and without apology, and for 11 years that was enough to hold the family together. However uneasily, Thomas and Clara built a good life on the edge of town. He raised horses. She kept the books for their small operation with the same honesty her father had taught her, and together they were, by the standards of Briar Hollow, comfortable. They never had children, a sorrow they carried quietly between themselves and rarely spoke of to others. But they had each other, and they had work they both loved. And for 11 years, Clara believed that was a kind of wealth no ledger could measure. Then, in the spring of 1885, Thomas caught a fever while driving cattle through a late snowstorm in the high pasture, and within 9 days he was gone, leaving Clara a widow at 32 with a grief so total she could barely remember, in the months after, what her own voice sounded like when it wasn't crying. It was in the 2 years following Thomas's death that everything Clara had built began, slowly, and then all at once, to come apart. Elias Whitfield had never transferred the deed of the house or the horse operation into Thomas and Clara's joint name, a fact Clara had not thought to question while her husband was alive. Because why would a wife need her name on a deed when her husband's love seemed deed enough? But with Thomas gone, Elias made it clear, gently at first, and then with less and less patience, that the property belonged to the Whitfield family, and that a widow without children to carry the name forward had no rightful claim to it. He allowed her to stay for 2 years out of what he called Christian obligation, though Clara came to understand it was closer to convenience, since her bookkeeping and her care of the horses saved him the expense of hiring anyone else. But in the autumn of 1887, with the horse operation struggling under a poor season and Elias looking for any way to cut his losses, he decided the simplest solution was to be rid of the widow altogether. He told her, on that cold porch, that she should be grateful he hadn't turned her out sooner, and that a woman of her age and situation ought to find gratitude wherever she could get it. Clara did not weep in front of him. She waited until she was down the road, out of sight of the house that had been her home for 11 years, before she let the tears come, and then she wiped her face, straightened her shawl, and kept walking, because there was nothing else a person could do with grief except carry it somewhere new. She walked out to the stable that same afternoon, past the boarded windows and the sagging double doors, and stood for a long while simply looking at it, the way her father used to look at a horse before deciding whether it was worth the trouble of saving. The main structure was sound enough, built of good timber that had weathered the fire better than anyone gave it credit for, though the loft above the north stalls was scorched black and half collapsed, its floorboards curling away from the beams like burnt paper. There was a for sale notice nailed to the post that had clearly been there for years, and when she inquired at the land office, the clerk, a young man named Percy Ames who had a soft spot for underdogs, told her the town had been trying to unload the property for so long that the asking price had shrunk to almost nothing, since nobody wanted a cursed stable with a burned loft and a dead man's reputation hanging over it. She had $9. She offered $8, expecting to be laughed out of the office, and instead Percy Ames simply shrugged and said the town council would likely take it just to be rid of the liability. And so, on a gray Tuesday morning in November of 1887, Clara Doyle Whitfield became the owner of the Cobb livery stable for the sum of $8. With $1 left in her handkerchief to see her through whatever came next, the men at the feed store did laugh, just as she'd expected. And word traveled fast that the widow Whitfield had spent her last dollar on a burned-out stable nobody else would touch. But Clara had grown up watching her father look past a limping horse to the strength still coiled beneath its skin, and she was not in the habit of trusting a crowd's judgment over her own eyes. She spent her first days simply clearing debris, sweeping out years of dust and rot, airing the stalls, and repairing what hinges and boards she could with her own 2 hands. Sleeping at night in a small tack room she'd swept clean and lined with straw, grateful at least for a roof, however imperfect, over her head. It was on the 4th day, while she was clearing the ruined loft in hopes of salvaging enough sound timber to rebuild it properly, that her hand brushed against a loose stone in the chimney flue that ran up through the loft wall, a stone that gave slightly under her fingers where the mortar around it had crumbled in the old fire. Curious, she worked it free and behind it, wrapped in a scrap of oilcloth that had somehow survived both flame and time. She found a folded note, its edges brittle, its ink faded but legible, addressed simply, in careful, deliberate handwriting, to whoever should next own this place. Clara sat back on her heels in the ash-smelling loft with that folded note in her trembling hands for a long moment before she found the courage to open it. Some instinct telling her that whatever was written, there had been waiting a very long time to be read. The handwriting, once she unfolded the brittle paper, was neat and unhurried, the hand of a man who had clearly written this knowing it might be the last thing he ever set down. It was signed Jeremiah Cobb and dated the 6th of September, 1881, 4 days before the fire that killed him. In it, Cobb explained that he had, for the better part of 3 years, served as the quiet keeper of the Briar Hollow Miners and Settlers Relief Fund, a modest but vital pool of money that the townsfolk had contributed to collectively. $1 here, $5 there, to be drawn upon by any family in the town who fell upon hard times, whether from a bad harvest, a lost breadwinner, or an early winter that caught someone unprepared. The fund had been kept, by common agreement, in the bank vault under the stewardship of the town's banker, a man named Horace Pruett, but Cobb wrote that he had grown increasingly certain, through small discrepancies he'd noticed while doing occasional bookkeeping for Pruett, that the banker was quietly siphoning from the fund for his own speculative land purchases, replacing what he took with promissory notes that would never be honored if the fund were ever actually called upon in a crisis. Cobb, being a cautious man without proof enough to accuse a banker outright in a town that trusted its bank without question, had done something quietly radical instead. Over the course of several months, he had persuaded a handful of the fund's original contributors to withdraw their shares directly and entrust the coin itself to him for safekeeping until he could gather enough evidence to expose what Pruett was doing. He had hidden that coin, he wrote, behind this very stone, in this very loft, and he intended to bring his evidence before the town council within the month. The note ended with a line that Clara would read again and again in the weeks that followed. "If I am not here to see this fund returned to its rightful hands, then whoever reads this letter must finish what I could not. The people of this town gave what little they had in trust, and trust once given is not a thing a man may spend on himself." 4 days after writing that note, Jeremiah Cobb had died in a fire that everyone in Briar Hollow had long assumed was some manner of divine judgment for secrets he'd been keeping, when in truth, as Clara now understood with a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold, he had died protecting the very money the town believed he'd stolen. She sat with that note for the better part of an hour before she moved again, turning over in her mind everything it meant, not only for the money itself, wherever it might still be hidden, But for the reputation of a dead man, the whole town had quietly condemned for 6 years without a shred of real proof. She thought of her father's ledger, of his voice telling her that trust, once broken, doesn't mend just because no one catches the breaking. And she understood, sitting in that scorched loft with her mother's sewing tin at her side and $8 worth of stable around her, that she had not merely bought a building. She had inherited an unfinished promise. It took her the better part of 2 more days, working carefully so as not to disturb the fragile old timber further, to find what Cobb's note had described. Behind a second, deeper cavity in the same chimney flue, wrapped in oilcloth and canvas that had somehow kept the damp at bay, she found a small iron strongbox. Its lock long since rusted, but not beyond opening, containing not a fortune. Not the kind of gold that might tempt a woman to greed, but a modest, careful sum of coin and a ledger in Cobb's own hand, listing every contributor's name and every dollar they had entrusted to him, down to the penny. It was, Clara realized as she read through the names by lamplight, a roll call of families she had known for 11 years. Families who had scraped together what little they could spare because they believed, rightly, that someday hardship might come knocking on their own door, and they would want a town that had prepared for it together. The difficulty, of course, was that a woman recently disgraced by her own father-in-law, sleeping in a burned-out stable she'd bought for $8, was not exactly positioned to walk into the Briar Hollow bank and announce that its respected proprietor had been embezzling from a relief fund for 6 years. Clara understood this plainly, and understood too that if she moved carelessly, Horace Pruett, a man of considerable standing in the town, with friends on the council and decades of trusted service behind him, could simply deny everything, discredit her as a bitter widow, inventing scandal to justify her foolish purchase, and the whole truth might sink back into the same silence that had swallowed Jeremiah Cobb. So she did what her father had taught her to do with any delicate matter. She gathered proof, quietly, patiently, and did not act until the proof could not be argued away. She began by visiting, one by one, the families whose names appeared in Cobb's ledger, not to reveal what she had found but simply to ask, gently, whether they remembered contributing to the old relief fund and what had become of it. Most remembered clearly, and most, she found, had assumed over the years that the fund had simply been quietly dissolved or absorbed into the bank's general accounts after Cobb's death, since no one had ever been able to draw upon it since. She spoke with the widow Alma Hartley, whose husband had frozen in a blizzard the winter before last, and who had gone to the bank seeking relief only to be told, gently, that no such fund existed anymore. She spoke with old Ezra Simmons, a miner who remembered contributing $5 in silver back in 1879, and who grew quiet and thoughtful when Clara asked whether he'd ever seen a record of it since. Slowly, carefully, over the course of nearly 3 weeks, Clara built a picture that matched Cobb's ledger almost exactly. Families who had given, and given trustingly, and had never once seen that trust honored. She also discreetly, through young Percy Ames at the land office, who had taken a genuine liking to Clara's quiet determination, obtained copies of the bank's own public filings on several land purchases Horace Pruett had made in his own name over the previous 6 years. Purchases that, when set beside the sums missing from the relief fund, lined up with an uncomfortable precision, asterisk. It was inevitable, in a town as small as Briar Hollow, that Clara's quiet inquiries would eventually reach Horace Pruett's ears, and when they did, he did not wait for her to come to him. He came to the stable himself on a cold December afternoon, dressed in his good wool coat, his manner pleasant on the surface in the way of a man accustomed to being obeyed. He told her, with a smile that did not reach his eyes, that he'd heard she'd been asking odd questions around town, stirring up old grief better left buried with Jeremiah Cobb, a man, he reminded her, who had after all died under circumstances the whole town still whispered about. He suggested, not quite as a threat but close enough to one, that a widow in her situation, without family, without standing, without so much as a proper roof that didn't still smell of smoke, would do well to consider how such questions might look to a town already inclined to pity her. Clara listened to all of it without interrupting, the way her mother had taught her to listen to an angry man until he'd emptied himself of bluster. And when he'd finished, she told him quite calmly that she had not been asking questions to stir grief, but to settle a debt, and that she would be very glad to discuss the matter further at the next town council meeting, in the presence of the very families whose money he had borrowed without their knowledge or consent. Something in her steadiness unsettled him more than any accusation could have, and he left without another word, though Clara understood from the stiffness in his shoulders as he walked away that she had made, for the first time in her life, a genuine enemy, and that he would not simply let the matter rest. In the 2 weeks that followed, Pruett moved quietly to protect himself, calling in favors, suggesting to certain council members over drinks at the saloon that the widow Whitfield's claims were the desperate inventions of a woman, embittered by her own family's rejection, a woman with every reason to want to tear down a respected pillar of the community. Clara felt the town's mood shift beneath her, felt the sideways glances grow sharper, heard secondhand that some now called her not merely foolish for buying the cursed stable, but dangerous for the trouble she seemed intent on causing. She might have lost her nerve entirely, might have folded under the weight of a town's collective doubt, if not for a growing handful of allies who had quietly begun to believe her. Alma Hartley, who remembered her own contribution too clearly to be talked out of it. Ezra Simmons, who had kept, it turned out, a small handwritten receipt from Cobb himself, tucked inside his Bible for 8 years without ever thinking to question it. And young Percy Ames, who had grown increasingly troubled by the discrepancies he'd found in the bank's own filings and who, at real risk to his position, agreed to present those filings honestly if called upon. The town council meeting was set for the 2nd week of January, 1888, held in the schoolhouse since it was the only room in Briar Hollow large enough to hold the crowd that word of the dispute had drawn. Clara arrived with Cobb's original note, his ledger, the strongbox itself, and the quiet, steady testimony of Alma Hartley and Ezra Simmons standing beside her, along with Percy Ames's carefully assembled bank records. Horace Pruett arrived confident, flanked by 2 council members he'd cultivated as allies, prepared to dismiss the whole affair as the fantasy of a grieving, disgraced woman. But when Clara read Cobb's note aloud to the packed schoolhouse, in his own careful, deliberate hand, explaining exactly what he had suspected and exactly what he had done to protect the town's trust, and when she followed it by reading, name by name, the ledger of every family who had entrusted their savings to him, many of those very families sitting in the room and recognizing their own names, their own long-forgotten contributions, a silence fell over that schoolhouse, unlike anything Briar Hollow had witnessed in years. A silence made heavier still when Percy Ames stood, visibly nervous but resolute, and confirmed that the bank's own land purchase filings matched, dollar for dollar, the sums missing from the fund. Horace Pruett, faced with his own bank's records read plainly before the very people he had wronged, found that his confidence could not survive contact with the truth, and in the face of that terrible total silence, he had no defense left to offer. The council, shaken and ashamed at how completely they had trusted the wrong man and doubted the right woman, moved swiftly once the truth was laid bare. Pruett was removed from his position at the bank within the month, and though the town, out of a certain weary mercy, chose not to pursue him through the courts, provided he surrendered the equivalent value of the missing funds from his own considerable land holdings. He left Briar Hollow entirely before spring, his name quietly erased from the respectable circles he had once commanded. The relief fund, restored in full and placed under a new committee that included, at the insistence of nearly the whole town, Clara herself, alongside Elma Hartley, was disbursed that winter to families who badly needed it, including a modest sum that finally allowed old Ezra Simmons to replace a roof that had been failing for years. And Jeremiah Cobb, whose name had been quietly blackened by rumor and suspicion for 6 long years, was at last given the reckoning he deserved. The council voted, unanimously and without a single dissenting voice, to place a small brass plaque on the rebuilt livery stable honoring him as the fund's faithful and ultimately self-sacrificing keeper, a man who had died protecting what did not belong to him rather than take the easier, quieter path of silence. Clara rebuilt the loft that spring with her own hands and the willing help of neighbors who, only months before, had laughed at her for spending her last dollar on a ruin. And by summer the Cobb stable, which the town had begun, without much discussion, simply calling Whitfield's, was doing steady business boarding and shoeing horses for travelers passing through the foothills, its books kept as honestly and precisely as her father had once kept his own. She never remarried, and she never sought out Elias Whitfield to demand any accounting for how he'd treated her, deciding in the quiet way she decided most things, that some debts were better left uncollected than chased at the cost of her own peace. But she did, every September, on the anniversary of the day she'd found that folded note behind the chimney stone, walk up into the loft alone and sit for a while beneath the small brass plaque, remembering the man whose quiet, unglamorous courage had asked nothing more of her than to finish what trust demanded. And so we return, as we always do, to where this story began. A 34-year-old widow, cast out with $9 and a carpetbag, who bought a burned, mocked, forgotten stable at the edge of a town that had already decided what she was worth. What the town could not see, and what Clara herself did not yet know when she handed over her last coins, was that the true value of that ruined building had nothing to do with horses or timber, or even the money hidden behind its chimney stone. Its true value lay in the promise Jeremiah Cobb had died protecting, a promise that trust, once given honestly, deserves to be honored just as honestly in return, even if it takes 6 long years and one overlooked woman to see it through. Clara Doyle Whitfield did not set out to expose a thief or restore a fortune or clear a dead man's name. She set out, simply, to make something of the only thing anyone would sell her. And in doing so, she gave an entire town back its faith. Not only in a forgotten stablekeeper, but in itself. Thank you for spending this time with us and with Clara's story. If it moved you, we'd be grateful if you'd share it with someone who might need to hear it today. And let us know in the comments, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had already written off? We read every one of your stories, and we treasure them. Until next time, stay close, **.